Well, morning panellists. John, I might start with you, Chair of the Board of BSI and Chair of Anglia Water. We talk a lot about purpose-driven organisations. It would be good to talk about where you see purpose-driven organisations in terms of how we create a better future.
I'd like to answer this in two stages. First of all, every time my mother persuaded my father to do less, he got older and smaller, and he lost purpose and lost energy as a consequence. And observation, my personal observation is backed now by a lot of studies that show that people who have purpose live more fulfilled lives and happier and healthier. It's true, I think, of organisations. I've never wanted to work for an organisation that just wanted to make money, or that it's a purpose, if you like to define it as that. I think a purpose for me needs to be something broader and to doing good. I was already on the board of Anglian Water and becoming chairman when I accepted the role as chairman of BSI. And in part, I confess, I accepted it because I could see an opportunity to really help BSI deliver a great deal more in this area than it had done. So we put Anglian, which has a good purpose, and people live the purpose in the organisation, but it wasn't explicit and it wasn't understood by people outside, and therefore the basis for trust was just personal experience rather than structure and evidence. And I saw in the possibility with BSI to create this PAS, which would be act as a guide and guarantor for people who wanted to demonstrate that having a purposeful organisation was better. It's a personal preference for me, but it's now backed by a growing weight of evidence that organisations who have a purpose that is understood and can be evidenced attract good people, keep good people, both as employees and as customers and clients, and they have a greater reputation as stakeholders. But I choose the words of guide and guarantor quite carefully because there's such a lot of, and if you excuse me, horseshit talked about this by people who like to grab onto the phraseology but don't really understand what it means or how to make it happen, that I think the world needs guides and guarantors to create the trust, particularly in a world where trust is fading sometimes, and some people see it as their purpose to undermine trust to their personal benefit. So people in this room are vitally important in the fight against that lack of trust for the benefit of all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we talked a little about greenwashing in Wayne's presentation, and that's similar, but it's kind of purpose washing in a sense. Nikki Stopford is chair of BSI's Consumer Forum. Nikki, from a consumer perspective, the decisions that consumers make about their purchasing, obviously they're impacted by these claims. What is driving consumer behaviour in this area?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is we all shop for and consume products and services in the room, so it won't be any surprise that some of the key priorities from a consumer perspective when they're buying those products and services are still things like quality, value for money, convenience and availability. But we're also seeing a huge trend towards people caring much more about the environmental impact of products and services. It was a trend that really accelerated during the pandemic when people became more conscious of the impact of the world around them and more invested in their own well-being. And it's a trend that has really continued, and consumer research is showing a real shift in attitudes and behaviours. And we're not just seeing that in what people are saying they're doing. If you look at Google Analytics, search trends or social data, you're seeing the same uplift. So there was a real peak in 2021 of search interest in sustainability, significant uplifts in people searching on terms like sustainability, but also in searching on phrases that show that they're really interested in and willing to take action as well. So phrases like, how can I reduce my carbon footprint being searched for more often, more searches for sustainable products. Mostly in high-income countries, but not exclusively. If you look at Twitter data, a real shift in people looking and talking about biodiversity, and big shifts, tens of thousands of movement. We're seeing the same trend happening in consumer organisations globally as well. So Consumers International, which represents over 200 consumer advocacy organisations around the world, has said that 94% of its members have now shifted their strategic focus to have sustainability front and centre. So a real shift in the right direction. However, what we're often seeing as well is the actions that people are taking. There's a mismatch in the actions that people are taking, I suppose, and the impact that that's then having. So people are often taking the easy choices, recycling more, using less, and being more concerned about waste, compared to some of the actions that would really have the biggest impact on household emissions, so changing the way you drive, changing your diet, changing the way you heat your homes. And that's often because of affordability. Obviously, we might not be able to tackle that today, but importantly about the complexity of these low-carbon markets and the difficulty in navigating those markets, and the real lack of quality information out there for consumers.
Well, hopefully affordability has been addressed down the road in Westminster today, so we'll come back to that another day. So the pandemic and the climate crisis is really fundamentally changing the way consumers see the world. We talked a little there, Martin, about the private sector and the way the private sector perceives itself. Martin Cottam is the chair of ISO's Occupational Health and Safety Management Committee and an expert in this area. Obviously, keeping workers safe is really important, but the growth of the global economy will be driven by small companies to a great degree. How do you see that? How do we bring small companies into this discussion? How do we ensure that there's an inclusivity in the way we write standards to support these issues of trust?
Well, I think, David, it's on the one hand, it's been very encouraging for me to see the progress that we've made over recent years in increasing interest in the topic of occupational health and safety. Some aspects of that, I think, have been driven through the COVID pandemic, but I think there are also factors such as the focus on the ESG agenda, sustainability, organisational resilience, which means that many organisations of all sizes are taking a greater interest and realise that the spotlight is on their OHS performance in a way that perhaps it wasn't in previous times. And I think standards have an important role. Wayne used that interesting phrase about norms changing. And it really struck a chord with me when I thought about ISO 45003, published just last year, on the topic of psychological health and safety in the workplace, the first international standard to address that topic. And I think, it was of its time that it should be produced when it was, and I'm not trying to take credit for everything that subsequently has happened by any means, or was already in train. But I think it has undoubtedly contributed to breaking down some of the taboos, which previously meant that this important aspect of occupational health and safety simply wasn't being discussed in many organisations, and certainly wasn't being addressed in many. And I think we have seen that gathering of momentum in terms of interest as a result of the publication of the standard. And there's further to go, because in fact, we were in a position prior to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic where there was an underlying, sharply upward trend in the occurrence of psychological harm to workers. That trend then spiked further due to the pandemic. But we're in danger of simply returning to the underlying trend. And just one more example, I guess, would be the document produced by our committee, ISO Pass 45005, actually during the COVID pandemic, safe working guidelines for organisations to help them navigate the challenges of managing the workplace in those difficult times. An important document, I think, from the point of view of trust, produced in 3 months from first meeting to publication and with participation of 70 countries. The important thing for me about that document was that for some countries it simply supplemented guidance, good quality, scientifically based guidance which existed at national level. But that wasn't the case all around the world. There were countries for which this became the prime source of guidance because there wasn't the same availability of good quality information. And indeed, in some cases, there were concerns that perhaps the information that was being made available in individual countries was subject to a degree of political influence. And in contrast, we produced a document written by OHS professionals and health experts for their peers and those managing those challenges in organisations. And I think that's really important contribution that standards can make to trust. But you mentioned SMEs, and I think it's really important that we recognise that amid these success stories, there are some real challenges for us in whether our standards are touching our entire target audience. And from an occupational health and safety perspective, SMEs represent by far the most important part of our target audience, simply by virtue of the number of employees working for small and micro organisations across the planet. If our work enables us to shift the dial or help companies across the world shift the dial on OHS performance, but only for larger organisations, we won't make much difference at all. If we can influence the OHS performance in small and micro organisations, we'll begin to have potentially a very significant impact. But I think that for us as standards writers, there is a huge challenge to understand the requirements and really how to get under the skin of the needs of smaller organisations, because they are typically outsiders to the standards development process. And it's very difficult to get them to be full participants because they are disadvantaged. It's the same challenge, which means that we struggle internationally to make sure that we're doing the right job in terms of developing countries. It's the same challenge, which means that we don't have the involvement that we need from young professionals in the writing of standards, because standards tend to be written by seasoned professionals who actually are not the audience for the finished document. Standards should be being written to encapsulate good practice to be used by people who are much earlier in their career, and we cannot hear the voices adequately of whether those documents are making sense to people. Are they providing the guidance they really need, or just the guidance that the writers think that they want to give them? And they may be quite different things. Yeah.
That's a great challenge that we might throw out to some of you, your standards makers. The views of young professionals looking at Wayne's slide there is very different from established business leaders, and so their voice is absolutely distinct in the process, so we might come back to that. And it's great to hear, we talked about norms changing around the world. It's great to see a standard there that could be actually not just reflecting that, but driving it as well. Hopefully the microphones are going to go around. Put your hand up if you want to ask a question. You might want to come back on some of Wayne's points, challenging the private sector. We've got lots of people here from companies. Whether you see yourself in some of those statistics would be interesting. But Kennedy and Mbeva, great to see you. Welcome. Kennedy's from the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. And congratulations, you're part of the Our 2050 World project that's just produced the net zero guidelines that we talked about being adopted at COP. So where do you see the key areas of confusion or inconsistency or mistrust around claims about sustainability?
Thanks a lot, David, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel, a very distinguished panel, and my apologies for being late, just caught up in traffic. I think building on this conversation, I think it's a good opportunity to reflect on the ISO Net Zero guidelines that were launched in COP on Friday last week as part of that event, and one could feel the moment during very tough negotiations on the one side, as countries negotiate, how to implement the Paris Agreement, but also kinds of initiatives that people are presenting that are contributing to implementing the Paris Agreement. So that's a context that I'll share my reflections. I think in terms of some of the big challenges that undermine trust in such processes, I'd pick 3 dimensions. The first one is ambition. And with the Paris Agreement, it's very clear what the world needs to do. That's countries or states and non-state actors to meet our climate goals. And scientific evidence and assessments have shown that we're still far off from being on trend to meet the global targets. And so there's a big gap in terms of ambition, what we're doing and what needs to be done. So I think in terms of building trust, ambition is one big gap, and it's becoming clear that we need all sectors of society to align towards the climate goals. So, and that very much opens the door for standards to play a very big role, because they shape each and everything, almost everything in this world. So they're like the fabric of the economy. So standards, people don't think of them as a very potent policy tool, but they have significant potential that can really help us to unlock some of the creative solutions. The second area I'd like to point out is credibility. And I think that has been mentioned quite a number of times. I have so many initiatives that have been announced, others still being announced at COP. And I think the biggest concern is about greenwashing. How credible are these initiatives? So many organizations and companies claiming, for example, to have attained net zero or to be on track to meet net zero, yet they're not transparent about how they'll get there. So I think in terms of credibility, there's a huge gap that needs to be addressed. And I think attention is really getting focused on how to ensure that claims that are being made are very much credible, and there's transparency and accountability. I think the third and final dimension I'd like to touch on, and that's a point raised by Wayne as well, is do these initiatives cover every part of society? And that sort of brings the issue of justice, which is a very normative issue, to the conversation. When we talk about the global economy, or we talk about standards or initiatives, we usually think about, for example, big companies or big entities, but we don't think much about, as you mentioned, small and medium businesses. As we develop these guidelines, do we think about them? And this was a critical question that we actually tackled when developing the net zero guidelines. And we had some participants who brought in quite some good perspectives and ideas on how we could embed some ideas on making sure that we try to bring everyone on board in terms of that developing and also applying the guidelines. Because if such kinds of actors don't participate in bringing the views on board to shape the guidelines, then the guidelines would make sense to them when we ask them to implement them. So those are the 3 key areas that I think they are major gaps, but I'll be happy to elaborate on that during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Kennedy. So I think we've touched on lots of issues there around more voices being heard, the consumer voice, the importance of SMEs and young professional, the corporate voice and NGOs in particular. I might come back to you, Wayne, on that question of diversity that you touched on. I might just take an international perspective. Do we have Jose Duran in the room? I believe he is with us. Jose. So we're very pleased to have with us this week in London Jose Duran. Jose is the chief executive of IBNORCA, which is the national standards body from Bolivia. Now, we've talked there about lots of different issues around diversity, and the developing country voice is a part of ISO's commitment to its WTO. It's part of the WTO commitments. How's the pandemic impacted on the ability of Bolivia to participate in the international process?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we're on.
Thank you, David. After pandemic, I think for IBNORCA was an opportunity, because we have to improve our process, because we need to be more competitiveness, and we have to change our perspective. For example, for the training courses, now we are virtually. Fortunately, we have a project to digital transformation, and our challenge is about many issues that we are talking now about the climate change, I think is very important for developing countries and developed countries. And we are in the study week now in London with BSI. I think it's a great opportunity to learn for us about our strategies of BSI. And we are very excited for this experience, and we want to learn and to implement it in Bolivia some important issues.
Right. Round of applause for Jose Duran. Thank you, Jose. It's great to have that international. It's great to have that international perspective. And so Wayne, so the COVID pandemic clearly has transformed the pace of change, and it's certainly led to innovations. So maybe you could reflect on a little bit on that, and also on this diversity that we've spoken around standards and how we make our decisions. Because I know diversity in decision making was a topic that you touched on, how decisions are made.
Yeah, I think we've learned a lot during the pandemic. It's been a great teacher, right? Because we are living in a disrupted world, and it will be even more disrupted. Certainly the climate crisis will cause much more disruption than the pandemic. And we've seen we can have wars as well, which completely disrupt. So I think one of the main things we've learned is that during a crisis, we can come up with solutions that people, once they get out of their comfort zone, can adapt very quickly. So and that we're far more resilient than we think, both as individuals, but also as institutions. So I think all of those lessons are going to stand us in really good stead. But, you know, when I think about the pandemic, the main thing it's taught us as well is it's enabled us to see what exponential change looks like. And so many of the crises we face, or let's say the challenges we face, are as a result of exponential growth of various things. I mean, whether it's carbon in the atmosphere or consumption of resources. I mean, all of these since 1970 in what's called the Great Acceleration have followed this kind of curve. And we know on a finite planet that's impossible, right? So the only way that leads to is collapse, unless we figure out how to put in some circuit breakers there. And so I think it's just made people realize how fast things can change for the worse, but also for the better, how we can come up with solutions and share them very quickly. I mean, the vaccines have been amazing, how quickly we did that. But I think it's all about challenging us to believe that change is possible. And I like to use a metaphor here, you know, that for many years, sustainability, and you've mentioned for consumers as well, it's been like, you know, our business as usual is a big juicy burger with fries, and we know it's unhealthy for us, but hey, it's delicious, right? And the sustainability has been the salad on the side, which hardly anyone touches, really. They know it's good for them, and we need to flip that. I mean, sustainability needs to be the main meal, and that's what I think people don't always get yet, is that there will be winners and losers in this transition. And from a customer perspective, I actually don't want to know all the details about sustainability. I want to know this is a company or a brand I can trust. Yeah. And that should include all taking care of slavery, taking care of climate, all of those things. And I don't want to pay more for it or have any inconvenience.
Any of the panelists want to come in on their positive impacts of COVID in the areas that you're interested in? I mean, is there a good takeaway that we can feel that things have changed during COVID? We talk about some of the innovations. Anybody want to?
Well, it certainly taught us that you could work more flexibly in a heartbeat. Things we've been talking about for 2 decades maybe suddenly had to happen, and we did it. Yeah. But it gives you a clue, I think, to has to happen. And too many of the things we talk about in sustainability seem to be long term. And I reflect when I used to run the UK Met Office, and I had in there the Hadley Centre, which is probably the world's leading climate change institution in science. And I spent 7 years of my life talking about climate change in conferences and lunches and dinners, and convinced people, yes, it was happening, it was always somebody else's problem. the worst thing of that, looking back at that, is that the messages that the scientists, I'm not a scientist, I was just peddling the message, that those messages were undermined deliberately by self-interest. Mm-hmm. And I do think that sometimes I'd like to go back and punch somebody on the nose. There's no retribution for that undermining of trust. Mm-hmm. It's a really shameful thing that nobody talks about, just how much damage people did. And it's cost us a decade, maybe more. And a decade at the beginning doesn't matter so much, but a decade at the end could be critical. And what we need to do in all of these areas is get that spirit of, it has to happen, let's get on with it right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to reiterate a bit, what we've seen from consumers is a real willingness to change. Mm-hmm. And so, we should take that and certainly run with it, but to really act and be more sustainable in the way you consume things, obviously that requires good quality information, it requires comparable information. And so that's really where, I think there's a real opportunity from a standards perspective to be driving that best practice, certainly behind the scenes and visibly as well for consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. Martin or Kennedy, do you want to come in on that?
I will, yes. I think we can all share John's frustration, perhaps not endorse the temptation to workplace violence, but I think... Yes,
I'll do it outside the workplace. I'll do it somewhere else.
I think there are some important lessons from the COVID pandemic for all of us in standards writing, certainly. For the committee that I chair, I think there have been some really clear, unambiguous gains. Mm-hmm. My slight concern with that is that I still sense that there is a sort of wistful wish to return to the way things were, and I believe that needs to be challenged. I think we have demonstrated, certainly in TC283, that the work of producing standards, whether guidance standards and other guidance materials, has been at least as successful, carried out entirely virtually. Not just in terms of keeping that work on track and delivering on time, and that included the extra document on the guidelines for the pandemic that I referred to being added into our work programme. Not just about keeping on time, but actually about the quality of engagement, the number of stakeholders who could be involved, and the extent to which we were able to build consensus. And just to elaborate two of those points, we have had and seen within TC283 a notable increase in developing country participation in our work as a result of moving from physical meetings to which many of these countries realistically could not send delegates, to virtual meetings in which they can participate every time. The use of Zoom, with its facilities for contributions made in written form in chat, has significantly enhanced participation from countries whose representatives are not native English speakers. The use of the polling buttons in Zoom has enabled us to identify with pinpoint accuracy the extent to which we have consensus within the room on a certain point. And because that's anonymous, we have found that it is much easier for people feel much more comfortable to signal that they have a concern if they're not about to find that they're putting their hand up in a rather uncomfortable situation right next to the person who spoke before in favour of the argument. And so we're much better able to test whether we've got consensus. We can put into the process additional iterations where we invite those who have concerns to indicate the nature of them and really try and put more time into trying to get to the point where we have a solution in front of us which everybody feels they can live with. And that is true consensus building. And I really genuinely believe that we have moved forward substantially through the use of virtual meetings in achieving proper consensus building, which we were just, with the benefit of hindsight, we were not achieving in the same way before. Yeah. So I think that there are some really important gains there. And as a result of that, certainly, my committee will not develop any documents in the future other than through virtual working. Of course, we want to meet together. We're human beings. We want to engage with stakeholders in the various geographies and try and build participation from developing countries, and we will travel appropriately for that. But we don't need to do that to write documents, and why should we anyway? If we're serious about the London Declaration and ISO's commitments to contributing solutions to the climate emergency, we need to lock in this learning, I think, share it, and really move forward.
Right. Well, a few of the people in the room might have trips planned to exotic locations to write some standards, so you might get some pushback. We've got a couple of questions down the front, so have we got some microphones coming down to the front? Here they come. But Kennedy, COVID was great for carbon emission reduction, right?
Some may say so. But I think what COVID revealed is the contradictions that we all face. We could see, for example, in a very short time, we managed to develop vaccines, which was a technological feat and quite incredible in showing the scientific and technological prowess that we have. But the moment COVID hit, we usually thought it was so globalized, but every country just shut down its borders, and everyone decided to take care of themselves. But also, those contradictions can be seen sort of in the aftermath of COVID as countries try to recover. Some countries have recovered quickly, others are still struggling with other crises that were exacerbated by COVID, such as debt distress, etc. So I think we can draw two lessons from the COVID experience and try to use them to be better prepared in addressing future challenges. I think the first one is on the need to start embedding things that are not easily measurable, especially in the standards world. We like things that we can measure because we can develop standards and measure and see whether we are tracking. But there are also things that we can't easily measure, normative things like fairness, like equity, like justice, which we saw even though we had scientific and technological prowess during COVID, we came up short on the normative questions, distributing vaccines, cooperating to help each other. We really fell short on that. And I think these are some of the ideas or normative things we can start embedding into some of the initiatives like the standards. They might not be easily measurable, but we do know they're important. And maybe they can open up new and creative ways of building solidarity, and maybe that could replace some of the mechanisms we've relied on, which haven't worked very, very well. So I think really trying to deal with those contradictions of what we do so well, but what we do so poorly, and trying to reconcile the two. I think that's the most important lesson I could draw from the COVID pandemic.
Okay, we've got one question.
I can just add two quick facts, very quick facts. I mean, when the economy was in standstill during COVID, and we thought, we must be saving the planet now because of all the reduction in carbon emissions. Carbon emissions only went down 7.5%. So that just shows us how fundamentally we have to change the whole economic system, right? Because it's not just about stopping flying, stopping driving. It's something more fundamental. And to your justice point, right? Still, I think today, less than a third of developing countries have had a first vaccine, developing country populations. So, there's normative issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we got one question here. We've got a second question here. So let's take both together and then we'll get some answers. Kerry.
Hi. Oh, it does work. Good. So I'm Kerry Stanaway. I'm actually one of Nikki's colleagues. I work for the Consumer Public Interest Network for BSI. We've talked a lot about COVID and the impact that it might have had on sustainability and the way people behave. What we haven't really touched on a great deal yet is the cost of living crisis. And how that affects people's enthusiasm for acting more sustainability. And I'm thinking both consumers, but also businesses who probably might be worried, and this is a UK problem, but also an international problem, about having to lay off staff and about supply chain issues. And then consumers are potentially worried more about putting food on the table and maybe choosing the most sustainable option. How can what needs to happen to make people prioritise sustainability when the cost of living crisis is so present, and what role can standards play in that?
Excellent question. Let's take the second question and then we'll get ready for your answers.
My name's Dr. Tahar. I work on a number of BSI, SEN and ISO committees in various areas. And I work in the health sector. And for me, one of the biggest anomalies we have at the moment is that when the NHS puts out a tender, the first hurdle you have to jump over is to fill in a lot of ESG-related forms. Having got past that hurdle, only 2% of the value of the points on the tender is against the ESG and 98% on price. And often the most sustainable solution is going to be a little bit more expensive, but in the long term for humanity, it probably saves money. So we haven't got a government that is really pushing that aspect. The second point, while I've got the mic, is Dr. Cottam gives us a lot of interesting points to discuss, but one of which, for me, has always been a challenge, is that BSI does not get the standards it produces readily available into SME hands. There's two major things that get in the way. One is price, and the second one is that the language that is forced upon standards writers is not digestible. One solution I'd like to bring to the room is whether BSI might make available to SMEs and to health practitioners standards as they're produced free of charge for maybe the first 6 months they're out there. Because these are not sales they're going to lose, but there is more likely to be uptake of the standards if people get them into their hands.
Wow. Okay, we might come back to that question on the business model. But any response on that, on either of those 2 points about the cost of living crisis and about short-termism in decision-making about ESG issues? Wayne, do you want to go first and then John?
I can kick off. On the cost of living crisis, I mean, this is going to hurt, right? There are no easy solutions. But I would say on a couple of things, you know, our grandparents, I'm guessing, lived through world wars and experienced some really tough times. One of the things it does is it teaches people to be frugal again, to really value what little they might have, to share more, to repair more. So there will be some of that behavior, the sharing economy, the circular economy. Of course, any support we can get is going to help. The other thing is it's a lot driven, as we know, by an energy crisis, the inflation and so on. And the quickest way to resolve that and to bring energy prices down is actually renewables. It's the cheapest source of new electricity in almost every country in the world. And so, you know, those things won't immediately help, but they will certainly help a little bit. And on the tender issue, I totally agree. Sometimes it can be a nudge theory thing where just having it there, even if it's a small percentage, can have an outsized effect. But in the end, it's how you get measured. Mm-hmm. We have a similar thing with business schools. We get the ratings that come out, the FT ratings and so on. They start to talk about impact on society, but the weighting for it is really tiny. Mm-hmm. So we have to change how we measure and how we reward.
Yeah. John and then Nikki?
I'll do both, actually. I think you can join the first question with the first question of the gentleman over there. Actually, there's a great deal of tokenism, and I don't think that the cost of living crisis is a reason for not working hard at sustainability. In fact, you could argue the other way around. It's an excuse for people to put it aside for a while, and I'm not being unsympathetic. People have tough times, but actually, if we just let it go as a society, we'll knock ourselves back another 10 years and find but there's another excuse around the corner if we want it. And I think the two things go pretty much hand in hand. The danger of you described of the 50 pages of ESG stuff and then no weighting to it is a degree of tokenism which frustrates the hell out of me, because if you're serious about collecting all the information, you ought to be using it. And I have to say, I know of organisations where the balance is the other way around. And if I can quote an example from Anglian Water, we had a massive target to reduce carbon. And by reducing carbon and making it a priority for all the engineers, we reduced cost at the same time. Because we we had a completely different look at the way we did pipelines, the way we bought concrete, and everything worked well. On the business model and the pricing of the standards, there is I share your frustration, and there is a little bit of a constitutional contortion that we do about what constitutes membership of BSI, and I think we ought to look at it really hard again, and I promise you we will.
Mm-hmm. Great. Martin, do you want to come in on that, and Kennedy? And then if you've got a question, put your hands up and we'll make sure a microphone comes to you so we can go ahead with the next one.
Yeah, I'll just touch on perhaps the challenges for organisations from an OHS perspective when organisations are under financial pressure. It may sound a little bit trite, but for me the starting point is always to remember that OHS, when done well, represents an investment rather than a cost to business, and that one has to have a sight on the cost, the financial benefit to the business of avoiding accidents, having healthy and motivated people who show up, go home safe, are enthusiastic and contribute. And I think, if you price that into the equation, it becomes a little bit more obvious that a degree of sustained effort is far more effective than just switching off the tap when things get a little bit uncomfortable. But I want to make another remark because we haven't really talked yet, or I've spoken mainly from the perspective of a standards writer, which might sound a bit academic and purist. But I'm going to speak more from the point of view of my last full-time day job as the quality director of the Lloyd's Register group of companies. I have experienced the pressure on a support function, quality management throughout a global organisation under times of price pressure. So I've also lived the reality of being told, actually, this is your budget. And although it's painful at the time, I combine, if you like, my experience of contributing to writing standards and trying to implement them. I've always found in the end that there were benefits to being forced to look very critically at the focus of what you're doing and the efficiency of what you're doing for the good of the organisation. And fat grows into businesses in good times despite good intention. And we do need to take that fat out, and we shouldn't be afraid to do it because we end up with leaner and more focused attention on the key risks within OHS. And we needn't be sacrificing safety in the process.
Yeah, resilient for the future. Sorry, Nikki, I missed you out. You were in the queue.
That's all right. Thank you. Really good questions. And I think probably just one thing to highlight is I think cost efficiency and energy efficiency can work hand in hand. And, even with this winter's price cap, we are going to see energy bills almost double what they were last winter. And so that alone is likely to shift patterns of consumption. But beyond that, there's a real opportunity for advice and support for certainly consumers on the other actions that they can take that will both have a positive impact on the environment, but also have a positive impact on their purse as well. And we've seen some really good examples with brands making shifts like that. So just one thing that's come to mind is Procter & Gamble with its campaign on its Ariel washing detergents, really simple and clear messaging around turn to 30. And that was supported in the background with information that reformulation of the product means that washing your clothes at 30 degrees is as high quality as it is and effective as it is at washing at 1460 degrees. So not only, which then had a positive impact on people switching to washing their clothes at 30 degrees. It was more energy efficient and it was also cost efficient as well. So there's opportunities, I think, to make sure that you're addressing and tackling both of those issues.
Yeah, businesses today. Kennedy, do you want to come in that?
Yeah, just a very quick reflection on the issue of accessibility of standards. I think part of the frustration is for those who work in the standards world, just knowing how potent a tool they are. For example, you have 24,000 or so standards, but also looking at the gap between what standards can do and what needs to be done. And I think in terms of translating sort of the potential of standards, we really need to get that outside of the technical or professional sort of community and sort of use that to push for a paradigm shift in that this is a very crucial tool in terms of addressing sustainability challenges that can really trickle down to various levels, but also touch many facets of society. So I think for me, the key point in terms of that very important point about accessibility of standards, not just in a technical way, but in terms of how we think of standards is a very important tool to address sustainability issues. And I think if we can embed sustainability thinking into those numerous standards, then It can be a very, very they're boring. I say that not in a pejorative way. Standards are boring, but they're very, very powerful. And I think that kind of paradigm shift in thinking about standards is very much necessary.
Thanks. Yeah, if we don't get standards used, there's no point really. So we've got a question here and a question there, short as possible, and another question there, and we'll try and get as many questions as we can. We'll start with a question down the front, please.
Yes, I'm interested to know whether you're depressed. I know that the drop in energy usage was only 7.5% during COVID and so on. Are you not depressed at the fact that everybody, despite the increased efficiency during COVID of people working from home where they could, everybody is now saying we've got to go back to the office? And I'm very pleased to hear, I'm also I chair one of the ISO committees, and we are asking whether we actually need to meet physically again.
Wow. Okay, let's come back on that one, back to about returning to the office. There's a question at the back.
Richard Forbes. The question is, to what extent is world population growth a factor that ought to be included in discussions of sustainability? From where I see, the only person that's making this point clearly is Martin Rees, the former president of the Royal Society. What are the panel's views, please?
Amazing. And isn't it the 8 billion person is just about to be born? Okay, so there's two questions there. Third question, and then we'll come to some answers.
Thank you. My name's John Cockaday. I work for the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in a team called the Better Regulation Executive, where we do what it says on the tin, where government departments feel they have to regulate. We try to encourage them to do regulation better, and part of that is using standards. Now, there has been a certain amount of turbulence at the top of government, but a recurring message is the need for greater innovation in the UK, and I wonder if the panel can say something about how they think standards can help to drive innovation.
Excellent questions. Right, standards driving innovation, return into the office, population growth. Who'd like to go first? Wayne, go for it.
On population, let me answer this by sharing a formula with you. Paul Ehrlich in the 1960s, an American economist, came up with a formula for impact, and it was environmental impact equals population times affluence times technology. And all of that has been true. But I think what happens when we raise the population issue is that we are downplaying the affluence issue. So if you look at where the impact in the world comes from, it's 20% of the population having 80% of the impact. And it's the rich countries. So, of course, those that are emerging, coming out of poverty, want a high quality of life, want human development, and should be able to get that. So actually the responsibility is not to shake our heads and tut-tut about how the population is growing. By the way, it's stabilizing, so it won't grow forever. Fertility rates are coming down. But rather to say, how can we change our lifestyle and our economic model so that we can prove that you can have a high quality of life with a low environmental impact, to decouple essentially economic growth from environmental impact. That's where we should be focused. And, you know, at the moment, you've probably heard this before, but if we all lived like a Brit or a European, we would need 3 planet Earths. If we all lived like an American, 5 planets, and the Middle East, 6 planets. So, you know, I feel like there's a little bit of judgment when we talk about population.
Yeah.
And I think it should be rather on how we change, how we make it possible. And I think, by the way, those other 2 factors are important. So technology, notice, is something that in the past has increased our impact. And now we have the opportunity where technology can decrease our impact if we use it correctly. And that will make it possible for more people to live on the planet.
Yeah, sustainable growth. So anyone else want to come in on any of those points about innovation, about returning to the office? What's the position on that, Nikki, as a home worker?
Well, I was going to come in on innovation, I will, you know, I mean, I think the returning to the office, I think there's, we've had a real shift. We should really capitalise on that and use it as an opportunity to embrace hybrid working. I think, we've seen working from home doesn't impact productivity, but it could impact, innovation and creativity. So there's a role for both, I think, there. And I think just on the regulation point and the innovation point, I think there's a real opportunity for standards there. And the first thing that came to mind for me was new regulations around right to repair, for example. They go so far in enabling people to live in a circular economy, but they might not go far enough, and that's where standards come in and can really drive best practice and innovation, particularly looking, creating spare parts that are available for the duration of a product's lifetime and things like that. So there are definitely opportunities in that space.
Some short, snappy answers from our colleagues on the end.
Should the population be taken into account? The simple answer is yes. But I do think the point you make about affluence is really important. I lived in Paris for 4 years, and you couldn't find a third-generation Parisian. I used to make it a game, because people who moved to Paris population was replenished from outside, and then people didn't breed because their standard of living was such that they wanted to maintain it, didn't have lots of kids. It's a different way of looking at it, and there's not one answer that goes around the world. The same goes, I think, for hybrid working. I think it depends on what you're seeking to achieve. There are some circumstances where actually there's no reason why we should go back to working in the same office ever again, but there are some places where you have to be at the coalface because you can't repair pipes or fix people's health remotely in absolute terms. Mm-hmm. So there's a mix. I do share the view that actually you lose a bit of creativity sometimes in some areas without getting human interaction and spark. And on the innovation stuff, I always have a belief that innovation comes more effectively and quicker out of structure than it does out of chaos. And in as much as standards can help us get best practice, confidence and trust, all of which are the bedrocks of innovation, they're a bedrock of it rather than something which impedes it.
Yeah, absolutely. Kennedy, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think I'll just share a quick reflection on the innovation and maybe look at it from a policy angle. And as it's becoming clear, for example, on climate change, it's a very contested issue, and especially when it comes to domestic politics. And it becomes so difficult, especially in some major countries where we need rapid decarbonization, but the politics are very, very difficult. It's hard to pass a law. These were more sort of softer approaches like standards or voluntary initiatives can play a role in terms of experimentation, building trust, and building confidence. And then at Blavatnik School in my research group, we've looked at different kinds of ways that some of these initiatives appear. And there's like a conveyor belt model of governance where for very difficult policy issues, you don't start with hard regulation. You start with more experimental forms, and then you build in and lock in lessons as you codify and strengthen that into regulation. And I think for the really politically contentious issues, maybe standards could play that kind of role of consolidating lessons, but also baking in some norms and ideas that can be codified later on into regulations.
Great message about innovation, Martin.
Yeah, I think for me, David, it's really key to trying to establish and maintain trust in our committee and its work, that we contribute to providing guidance to help with solutions to current problems, that standards are not a rearview mirror on previous good practice, but are in fact at the cutting edge of defining and capturing and encapsulating good practice going forward. And it's for that reason, for example, that only last week we've announced a new initiative with a view to developing guidance on the OHS implications of climate change. There's a degree of evidence building now which tells us that organisations are very often quite alert to the risks of climate change and addressing those in their quality management systems. But rather surprisingly, only a smaller proportion of organisations are thinking about climate change in relation to the impacts on the health and safety of their workforce. And I think it falls to us as a trusted source of information on OHS to be highlighting that as a concern and to be providing help to organisations as to how to get started on that journey and to contribute to sharing good practice in order that people can move forward more quickly. And in the same vein, we've recently offered our services to work with, in response to an inquiry, to work with organisations who are non-traditional employers. And I'm thinking here about those kind of organisations who have people working on their behalf, but they do not employ them. So we're thinking of the delivery companies, and there are various other organisations who use that same kind of platform model. Now, this is a group of workers whose OHS needs have not, frankly, been well addressed through existing standards, and which are not particularly well addressed, I would suggest, in many countries through legislation either. And certainly the feedback we've had from a representative of an overseas government was it would be fantastic for standards to be the vehicle to bring together good practice, to bring the sector together to discuss what can be done, and to build consensus around what are the right expectations on organisations who are working to that kind of employment model. So I think that there's a lot we can do to support change.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask each of you in a second to come back on with one positive takeaway that we can take from today. But before that, Nikki, you wanted to come in on this question?
I was just going to pick up on the point about trust in standards. And, I think there's a real opportunity there to make sure that we are not just thinking about the audiences for standards, but also the end beneficiaries of standards that often are consumers. And in order to think about those individuals that will be benefiting from driving best practice, we must make sure that that standards are being developed in a way that represent consumer interests and consumer needs. So, drawing on really effective participation with the work that the Consumer and Public Interest Network does by actually putting consumer representatives onto standards, but goes beyond that as well and looks at the role of wider public engagement in really making sure that we're shaping standards in the space of sustainability in the right way. And that's not just something I'm saying as chair of the Consumer Forum. It's a point that the Climate Change Committee has made as well, that effective public engagement behind the scenes is really, really important as well.
Yeah. Wayne, do you just want to come in?
Yeah, just to add something on the standards and innovation point. I also think collectively we must look in the mirror and be honest with ourselves on what standards have achieved or not achieved. If standards are a lowest common denominator, as sometimes they have to be to get consensus, and if standards are still, and they're not all, but if standards are still largely based on the quality standard of continuous improvement, this results in incremental change, and that's just not enough anymore. It's not enough to create the kind of innovation, the kind of step change that we need. I mean, we've had ISO 14000 now, 25 years? And look at the environmental crises that we're in. And it allows companies sometimes to feel complacent. Yes, I have a management system in place. So I'm very much in favor of also combining this with performance standards and having them very ambitious, because that's where you get innovation. When you say, okay, I need you to do the impossible within 10 years. Now, figure out how to do it. And that's what we're asking companies. How do you get to net zero? How do you, reverse these crises? And we have to be very firm on that. Otherwise, we might just be legitimizing complacency and incremental change.
Interesting. Well, I'm sure there's opportunity at lunchtime to have more of a debate with Wayne about that. I'm sorry that we haven't had time to get to every question, but we are going to take lunch shortly. So I'm just going to ask the panel. I'm going to start at that end, John, and then maybe you can go last, Wayne, just to give us a positive takeaway that we can take from the work that you see going on, particularly around trust, but in your area in particular.
Look, I think there's a momentum in our organisation and its ecosystem, all of which you are part, and a keenness to address really, really big issues. And I can just promise you that the organisation within BSI, which you associate or are part, is really just going to commit to it, because we have such a lot of potential to do a great deal of good, and we are still underpunching our weight. I am determined that we will increase that influence and power as we go.
Right. Martin.
Yes, thank you, David. I guess for me, I'm always just so impressed and so humbled to see the amount of work that's done by representatives from just shy of 100 countries who participate in the technical committee that I lead. And I look at the fact that it involves working inevitably, because we're spread through every time zone on the planet, working in people's private time and in quite unsociable hours. And I look at the amount of dedication and devotion that people have brought, especially through the difficult months of the pandemic. And that gives me great optimism that we have a core there of really committed people who are working extremely hard to try and provide the guidance that organisations need to help them improve their occupational health and safety. But I think it's incumbent on us not to sit back and rest on those laurels, because I think there are really two important things which certainly for me as a standards writer are critical and need greater attention, and that's making sure that all stakeholders are in the room participating in the development process, and we have more to do on that. And secondly, making sure that once people are in the room, all voices are heard, and are heard on an entirely equitable basis. And that is a work in progress.
Yeah, work in progress. Kennedy?
I think my main takeaway is an appreciation of how powerful standards are or can be, and even more importantly, how purpose-driven standards can be very powerful in helping us address our global challenges. I think that's a revelation that has unfolded for me over the past year as I've worked on this topic, standards and climate change. But I do think in terms of these big global challenges that cut across countries but also penetrate deep into society, we do need a paradigm shift. And I think that also includes how we think about standards, not, as you said, as an incremental tool, but as a very powerful tool. But we have to marry the standards with purpose. Of course, that generates a lot of tension between incumbency. There's a way we do things, and there's a reason why we do things in a certain way. But also innovation, where we are, we have the courage to take the risk and use this very powerful tool to address some of the really pressing challenges. So for me, that kind of courage and movement towards that kind of purpose-driven standards is a positive thing that I take from this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kennedy. Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to say 60% of the reduction in CO2 emissions by 2035 requires on consumers making low carbon choices. So I think that's where there's a real opportunity from a standards perspective to be really focusing on those areas of standards development that will help consumers make easy choices and be much more impactful. And we're seeing a lot happening from a regulatory perspective, from consumer policy perspective, from a standards perspective in starting to tackle that, particularly around misleading claims. So that's a real positive shift. And I just wanted to just end on the point of the dedication and commitment as well, because and we've got a lot of that within BSI, certainly from the perspective of consumer engagement. And if anybody didn't attend the session on consumers and trust that Kerry Stanaway and Julie Hunter, the chair of CPIN, ran yesterday morning, then I would highly recommend watching it back when it becomes available online, because it really shows that and brings to life that passion and commitment and the importance of engaging with consumer audiences in standard setting.
Fantastic. Wayne, to finish.
Yeah, just before this session, I was watching an interview with Greta Thunberg. It's a wonderful one. And she was asked, if you could time travel, where would you travel to? And she said, nowhere. She said, this is the time. I mean, this is the most crucial period in history where we all have this extraordinary opportunity to make a big positive difference, given also the scale of the challenges. Mm-hmm. It's back to the purpose question. We're being given on a silver platter the biggest possible purpose that we could have in our lives to change this breakdown into breakthrough. But what I would say is sometimes it's overwhelming, right? Especially if you watch the news too much or read too many facts and figures. And so the takeaway message I would say is you shouldn't try to change the world. You don't have to change the world. but you do have to change your world. Yeah, because we're in this amazingly connected living system, and if everybody changes their sphere of influence, it ripples through the system and you get those reinforcing feedback loops and you get the convergence and you get the tipping point change, and it's a positive transformation. So that's what we need to do.
Fantastic. Well, there's lots of work to do there to get their standards into the hands of SMEs, to make sure all voices are heard, and to make sure that we've got consumer voices there as well as part of that process. Please join me in thanking our panel: John Hirst, Martin Cottam, Kennedy Mbeva, Wayne Visser and Nikki Stopford.